the other person speaks to the text. So, and this is the way you learn. And then we'll open up to you as well. The text will range from the text from the Torah, so 3,500 years ago, all the way to the texts that were written a couple of years ago. So it really is a full spectrum of Judaism. We'll start by saying the blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I will pass my space and the mic to Rabbi Daniel, who is going to read the first source on the source sheet. And if you cannot see it, that's okay, because a big chunk of the Chavruta learning is listening to your partner read the words out loud. There's a great power in hearing the words.
Are there papers that you're giving out?
We decided to go paperless.
Okay. Oh, well, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Is this on? Can people hear me? Amazing. Well, I wanted to, we were thinking of which sources to start out with, and I always like creating these, poles of tension within Jewish tradition, and oftentimes, at least one of the frameworks that I want to use, we'll probably use a couple frameworks, is within Jewish tradition, there's oftentimes different opinions on different poles, and often we think of this as representing two different thoughts among different types of Jewish thinkers. But I want to try to propose that these two different tensions should be a tension within every single one of us whenever we think of Israel. And on the one side is everything that Rav Mati said and everything we read about in our Torah portion today, which is Jewish connection to the land of Israel or state of Israel is conditional. In other words, if Jews do X, Y, or Z, then we merit to have the land, and if we don't do X, Y, and Z, we merit to lose the land. That's one pole of Jewish tradition. The other pole, represented by Rashi, which is the first source, is there's sort of an unconditionality nature of a Jewish connection to the land, and you'll see why I think it's an interesting conversation to compare these. So this is Rashi, the 11th century French sage, and he's commenting on the first verse of the Torah. And so just a reminder, I know it's been a couple months, right? The Torah opens in the beginning. God created the heavens and earth. So here is Rashi's commentary. He says, the Torah, which is the law book of Israel, should have commenced with the verse in Exodus, this month shall be unto you the first of the month, which is the first commandment given to Israel. So Rashi asks a question, and his question is, well, hey, the Torah is a book of law, so why don't we start with the first law, which doesn't appear all the way to Exodus, right? The idea that we bless the month and Rosh Chodesh. Why are we bothering with the entire book of Genesis, and why are we bothering with the first half of Exodus? We don't learn a lot of laws there. And Rashi's answer is, because of the thought expressed in the text, God declares to God's people the strength of God's works, i.e., God gave an account of the work of creation in order that God might give them heritage of the nations. For should the people of the world say to Israel, you are robbers because you took by force the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan, Israel may reply to them, all the earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be He. God created and gave it to whom God pleased. When God willed, God gave it to them. And when God willed, God took it from them and gave it to us. And so this is Rashi's answer, again, writing this 1,000 years ago, and he's saying, well, there's going to come a time when people are going to give testimony against the Jewish people and say, you don't actually have a connection to this land. And so for Rashi, it was important to establish, first things first, God created everything, and so God essentially gets to make these decisions. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, and then I'll give one more piece of, I think, interesting historic framing.
So I love this, and I love this. I struggle with it, but at the same time, it's a side of Jewish theology that's also very important. That underscores the Israel's spiritual connection with the Jewish people, and also underscores Israel's chosenness and Israel's specialty. So there's a teaching in the Talmud that that there were 10 portions of beauty given to the world, and I think 9 of them were given to Jerusalem. So there's a sense of truly uniqueness on the land of Israel. And yesterday, when we had one of the people who attend services here, come in the last half a year, she's making Aliyah on Thursday. So she said she's the person who never visits the same place twice because she always wants to go somewhere new. And then she says, and yet she's going to Israel to actually live there, because there's something that makes her, go over there over and over again. So, so there are some connections, sense of beauty or resonance of a particular place with the people that seems God chosen or God given, and that's what I think about when I read this source.
Yeah, I love that. And just one thing, just to put it in a little bit of context, because one of the interesting things is this seems like it could have been written, 2 months ago by, a Jewish op-ed writer writing about current politics. But what was going on in Rashi's time in terms of the current politics is Rashi's probably writing this sometime in the late 1090s, which, just a crash course reminder of European history, this was when the First Crusades was alive and well. And one of the things that the First Crusade saw were essentially a slew of theological arguments from the dominant Christian world and Muslim world about why their respective religions deserve to have the land, and obviously mostly by Christian crusaders, essentially making the argument of Jerusalem is ours, Jerusalem is ours. And Rashi in France, which is one of the capitals of the Crusade movement, is writing this, and he's saying, well, once we're playing this game of theology, it's not so simple to say, who deserves any land. And so Rashi's also engaged in a little bit of, political polemic here. Yeah.
So basically, also kind of like adding on this, and I love this historical direction. I didn't think about it at first. It's kind of like to say that back in the day, in the 1090s, in the end of the 11th century, the Crusaders not only went for the first crusade, but they also conquered the land of Israel and controlled Jerusalem for 100 years and established the kingdom of Jerusalem there for 100 years. So it's almost like a certain country conquers a different land, and it's a contested era, and then saying, well, actually, if you're playing this game, who deserves it more? We were there first, and God has given to us first. So it's almost like, the might is not always right, that people have a spiritual right to the land that arises from faith, rather than, from, where the Muslims or the Christians in the Crusader wars stronger.
Yeah, and I think it also establishes, and this sort of might be a good interlude to the next couple of texts, this idea that is sort of ubiquitous within Jewish sources, which is, well, at the end of the day, the land of Israel, the physical land, is actually unable to be owned by anybody, because the idea is that it all belongs to God. So therefore, this is a land that requires a certain type of higher moral living than other lands, like, Orange County couldn't be, owned by anybody. But, our tradition is very clear that the land of Israel itself actually has separate, laws of land ownership, to the point where, this will make anybody who's interested in real estate very upset. There are laws that the book of Deuteronomy outlines that if you sell land in Israel, after 50 years, it automatically reverts back to the original owner.
We're at it today, so.
Yeah, and so, fascinating sources of, how do you run any type of, economy if I sell my house to, Fred, 50 years later he has to, give it back. But this is exactly the ideal, at least, that the Torah sets out of. This is not a land where you can actually own anything, the sabbatical year and Jubilee year, all fields revert to their original owners, all loans get canceled. And so there is a sense in which Israel, as outlined by the Torah, is presented as sort of this ethical, idealistic utopia. Whether or not this was ever practiced is sort of a question for the historians, but we're not historians, right? And so this ideal is sort of outlined in Israel based off of this idea of, no, actually, this is a land that isn't just the normal, as Rav Mati said, might makes right, anything goes, that the rest of the world seems to play by.
Let's scroll down a little bit, and we now have a quote, first, actually, in chronology in the Torah, the first quote about, the ownership of the land of Israel, and it's a promise that not even to Abraham, but still to Abram before he gets renamed, and that's in Genesis 15. On that day, the Eternal made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." So if you think about it, think about geography, that is a very big area. Rabbi Daniel, over to you.
Yes. That is not the current geography of Israel. That is the statement. No, I think this is interesting, because I think you can kind of see these two poles of our tradition arise, where one intent of our tradition is to make the claim that we are people of the land of Israel. Jews come from Judea, and we are the indigenous people, and therefore have this sort of ultimate claim that's unconditional to the land, and you can very much see this sentiment being expressed in, God's covenant with Abraham, right? Abraham, this is a couple chapters after Genesis 12, where Abraham's willing to leave his house and actually travel to the land of Canaan, aka Israel. And then later on, Abraham makes this, sort of strange covenant with God, where he offers a series of sacrifices, and then God says, okay, because you've done this, now here's the promise. And this doesn't seem conditional. But then later on, we start to get a sentiment, especially in the later books of the Torah, in the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, that does seem to flip the switch and say, no, actually, there is something conditional about attachment to the land of Israel.
And I think as a Reform rabbi, so somebody who doesn't take Torah literally and doesn't say that everything was, exactly the words of God, one to one, I always use this quote, actually, when people say, the land is ours, it says so in the Bible. And then I say, Genesis 15:18, all the way from the river of Egypt, which is not the Nile, but it's a small river, on the very west of the Sinai Peninsula, roughly around where the Suez Canal is today, all the way to the Euphrates. So I say, so if you play by you live by the Bible, then, go ahead, attack Syria and Iraq as well to get the land all the way to Baghdad. So any biblical source, so when somebody says that they just lived by the Bible, it's a Bible according to a certain interpretation. So if somebody says, the land is all ours, then I say it's all ours because at some point down the line, the people decided to follow the interpretation that limits the land from Jordan to the sea and not, from the river of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates. So, so the beauty of a very diverse tradition with many sources is that requires interpretation, and the interpretation is based on a selection of sources or finding a way to streamline the sources with each other. So, so this is one of these quotes, particularly when I speak to, to Christian right-wing Zionists who say, oh, the land of Israel, and I'm like, and how do you deal with that? And then they don't know what to say sometimes.
No, I love that. I know the only thing that popped into my head is that, Abraham's name means father of many nations, father, of nations. And so the claim that, this is just the Jewish people doesn't even really check out with, even if one were to take a literalist interpretation, which I don't think either of us do, still isn't this is only for, one line of Abraham, right? The idea is that Abraham was the father of many nations. So I think you still have that tension, which still, I think, precludes you from saying, this is our land based off of, God's promise, which of course is not what, Jews have really believed. The interesting thing about, Rashi's first source is in the medieval period, Jews were sort of forced to play into this polemic game because there were other groups saying this. And so sort of, defensive polemic of saying, okay, once we're going down that route, we can discuss this. But actually, our tradition is probably best summarized by, later sources. If we can scroll down a little bit more and go to Deuteronomy here.
And now the quote is yours.
Amazing. So this is the beginning of Moses' speech to the Israelites as they're about to cross over. And here, at least in the beginning, Moses seems to reiterate the promise in Genesis. And then we'll see he quickly switches his tone a little bit later on. But here he says, "See, I have set the land before you. Go in and take possession of the land that the Eternal swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to give to them and to their descendants after them."
So I think this is, for me, the quote that is such a powerful quote because it refers to the individual promise to each of the ancestors. But also what always strikes me in this particular quote is the fact that each of them in their very own way worked in the land. Each of them developed his very own relationship in the land. So just like in the Amidah, where we have multiple ancestors because each of them had a different relationship to God, here we have a promise, a triple promise to each of the ancestors, and each of them has a different relationship with the land. So it's almost like saying, go and take it for yourself, just like your ancestors who had, each of them had a different relationship to the land of Israel. So you will develop your relationship too.
Yeah, I love it. Maybe we'll scroll a little bit more just to get the other texts in conversation here.
And now I think I'm reading.
It is you.
Do not defile yourself in any of those ways, so the ways in which the nations defile themselves, for it is by such the nations that I'm casting out before you defiled themselves. Thus the land became defiled, and I call it to account for its iniquity, and the land spewed out its inhabitants.
I love this. So now we start to get a little bit of the sort of other side, right? So the first poll, just a reminder, Genesis 15, Deuteronomy 1, where it's sort of this assumption that the natural destiny of the Jewish people is to go to this land that they were promised and inherit. All of a sudden now in Leviticus, and then also later on in the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, we start to get this other side of the story, which is there's actually this ethical nature to the land that you can almost think of Israel as having its own moral gut reaction to, people doing good or bad things. And so the flip side of the story that the Torah gives us is it's almost taking the other side of the story. In other words, we get that the Israelites merit to have the land, but why did the nations who were there, why, at least in the Torah's philosophy, why did they merit to lose the land? And now the Torah starts to come up with this, what can be called theology of the land, which is this is a land that actually has a moral dimension to it, that abhors ideas such as, child sacrifice, which we know was common in the ancient Near East, and types of moral living that, do not fit together in parallel with the principles outlined in the Torah.
I think so. So I think I like this quote because it gives you like a moral interpretation of why the seven nations lost the land. However, I do struggle with it when it's sometimes used, and I have seen it used in parts of the discourse as a way of making a one-to-one comparison between the ancient nations of the land of Canaan and the Arab population before the beginning of Zionism. So when I once I read the text which said, well, they made sure that the land had marshes and malaria and and deforestation, therefore they were like the Canaanites. I'm like, yes, you can stretch it like this, but I'm not quite sure if that's what the text says, because it more refers to their immorality, like child sacrifice and and just exploitation of the poor. So so it's a good source which teaches us a moral lesson, but it wouldn't necessarily stretch out political arguments and bring the reality of 3,000 years ago to 19th, 20th century nationalism and kind of economic policy.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I think it also could be when you have the camera pointing forward and then you press the button and the camera points back. There's probably some word for that. But
rewind.
No, not rewind. Self-reflection. Taking a selfie. Maybe in modern lingo, right? But I think this can both be used to indict others. But then I think you do get the personal moral dimension here, where, interestingly enough, the land of Israel doesn't seem to differentiate between who's doing the immoral action. So, of course, the theology that's outlined in this week's parsha and in other parshiot and portions in Deuteronomy is, well, if the Israelites fail to uphold their responsibility in the land, they're also going to lose it. And that's exactly, historically what happened. And, we can sort of talk about the theology of whether or not we agree with this, but at least historically, one of the things we'll see in a couple of lines is Jewish thinkers have long connected the destruction of the temples, not to, well, our armies weren't strong enough, but to actually internal moral action. So the Talmud says, why was the first temple destroyed? Because there was bloodshed, because there was immorality running rampant, there was idolatry, right, kind of bringing in this child sacrifice angle. And then later on, I think it's one of the sources we brought, why was the second temple destroyed? Because of sinat chinam, right, basic hatred. And so the Torah doesn't actually differentiate here. It's not, so one who would say, well, this gives ultimate claim to a land to a certain people, that seems to go contrary to the mood of what Leviticus is saying here.
Mm-hmm. Let's scroll down, and this commentary belongs to Rabbi Daniel. Well, of course, it was written by Ramban, but
yes,
Rabbi Daniel will read it B'Shem Ramban, in the name of Ramban.
So Ramban asks, the 12th century Spanish rabbi, why should the land be affected by these personal immoral acts? And then he answers, the land of Israel is unlike other lands. It is unable to contain sinners due to its inherent nature. Thus, the land, which is the inheritance of the glorious name, will vomit out all who defile it and will not tolerate worship of idols, nor those who practice immorality. Now, I do not have permission to explain on the subject of Haaretz more than this. So this is, very classic of Ramban's type of commentary. He was, North Spain, 12th or 13th century, and he sort of introduces mysticism into his commentary. So he is one of the originators of the growth of Kabbalah, and he oftentimes will give a commentary and then he'll add, I don't have permission to give you the deeper secrets. So it keeps us guessing to figure out what those are. But it seems interestingly, it seems like one could make an argument that for him, the land of Israel has a spirit that doesn't operate anywhere else. And so, you could think of, the land of Fullerton or of, Tustin being neutral, right? This isn't land that has feelings or land that has, certain desire to have certain institutions built on it, right? Like land is neutral, it's land. The Ramban seems to put forth a philosophy where Israel is not considered other lands. Just like Ramati said, that the Talmud says 9 out of 10 pieces of beauty were on Israel, the Ramban would add, and he would say, this is a land that actually is sort of an internal scale that can weigh immorality, and when there are practices happening that go against this baseline morality, the land just, the knee-jerk reaction is for the land to, as Leviticus says, to vomit out the inhabitants. It's not, it's not even a choice. It's just, it can't handle what's been happening on it.
So whenever I read this commentary or similar commentaries, I always feel that that it's almost as if God has imbued a land of Israel, with some sort of like sentience. Like the land of Israel is kind of like a partner of God in assessing if the Jewish people behave well. So it's almost like a sense, when you have Parshat Ha'azinu, when there's the idea that the land and the sky are looking at the people. You almost have a sense that the land and the sky of the land of Israel, the ground and the sky are looking at the people. So there's a sense of kind of almost a personhood of the land of Israel.
Yeah, I really like that. And just the other, biographic component, I just taught a medieval Jewish history class, so the dates are all fresh in my head at least. Nachmanides, or Ramban, was one of the few rabbis in the Middle Ages who, at the end of his life, made a pilgrimage, and he actually moved to Jerusalem. And, next time you're in the Old City, you walk right into the Jewish square of the Old City called the Rova, and the huge synagogue that's there is called the Ramban Synagogue, and he established a synagogue sometime in the 11 or 1200s, and this again, was his answer of, he felt this calling to the land, and this is a very large, this is probably Ramban's, he writes like 4 pages of commentary on Leviticus 18. This is just a small snippet, but he puts forth actually one of the most radical, thoughts of any medieval Jewish philosophers, where he actually says the entirety of the Torah and the mitzvot actually only apply in the land of Israel. It's an opinion that, very much bothered other, Jewish thinkers. But in the Ramban's view, the only reason why one would practice the laws of Judaism outside of the land of Israel is practice for when they get back into Israel, which, was a minority opinion, so you're not all off the hook for, next year, Yom Kippur and whatever. But Ramban would say that, this is, that Judaism is meant to be rooted within a land because Judaism is establishing a lifestyle that is in direct response to this land necessitating a higher form of moral living. And so for the Ramban, Judaism didn't really make sense outside of the land of Israel, which is why, again, at the end of his life, he leaves everything he knew, and he was a very well-respected rabbi in Barcelona, and he travels, makes the trek to something he knew nothing about, right? You can't just Google, hotels to stay at in Jerusalem, right? And he ends up wandering, much like other, Spanish thinkers such as Judah Halevi as well, who did the same thing, where they decide to essentially risk everything and, travel to Jerusalem.
And I think this kind of mystical sense that Ramban was embodying, it has a lot to do with the concept that there's a Yerushalayim shel Mala v'shel Mata, so Jerusalem of the above and the below. So it's almost like if you ever watched or read any books that deal with like a multiverse, like multiple universes, so it's almost like there's the heavenly Jerusalem from above, the ideal Jerusalem, you can call it heaven, you can call the other space, Olam Haba, and so on, and the Jerusalem of here. And one could say that this is like, in each story that deals with multiple universes, there is a point where the worlds touch, and this is the moment we can cross. So there's almost like, like Jerusalem is or the land of Israel is the closest between the universes, because between the ideal universe and, and our universe, it's almost like, you need to practice only there, because only there, kind of by practicing, you can pierce through this barrier that separates, the Jerusalem of above and the Jerusalem of below. Yeah, I love that. Yes, Mitch?
How does that differ in any way from Leviticus 18 that talks about what it is to be holy? Trying to be holy on this ground so that you can be holy to God later on, even with all the mistakes you make while not following the rules of Leviticus 18, but trying to rise yourself up to be holy. How is that different from Jerusalem on the ground versus Leviticus 18? Isn't that something that these people have to fucking aspire to do and never did it without fire?
So I think this is a big topic. The way I would see it, really simplifying, is that that if one day everybody gathers in Jerusalem and practices the way in which the rabbis would have wanted, then we are able to bring about the messianic age, and kind of like basically then the Jerusalem of below becomes the Jerusalem of above. That's the way I would see it. Rabbi Daniel, how about you?
Yeah, I think so. I like your question. I don't know why, but my mind immediately went to, one of the most famous books written in the last 300 years in the Jewish community was a book called Jerusalem by Moses Mendelssohn, who was very different than, he was definitely not he was predates Zionism. He was, a Jewish Enlightenment thinker. But for him, he uses the idea of Jerusalem to put forth, what he considers to be a political ideal for equal rights in the, he was writing this in the 1800s, so in the 19th century at the time. And so I think we do sort of have these ideas of Jerusalem, the physical place that we can all go visit to and, take an El Al flight, and then Jerusalem, the ideal. For Ramban, he essentially connects it to. He says that because the land of Jerusalem and Israel writ large demand a certain type of moral living, that is the code of moral living for the rest of the world. And so for him, they're sort of one of the same.
Yeah.
Moral living, do you think the Rambam or any of these other big thinkers necessitate peaceful living? Or how would they reconcile this, maybe perhaps the necessity for violence?
So I would say that unlike other religions, unlike Christianity and Islam, Judaism, apart from the war of the conquest of the land of Israel against the 7 nations, Judaism has never been a religion with a concept of a holy war, but Judaism was a religion with a concept of justified war.
Yeah, I think that's well put.
And I think there's a huge difference between it is our duty to conquer as much land and convert as many people as we can to our faith, versus it's our duty to defend our people so that we can live in peace. There's a huge, I would say, moral difference. So in this way, I would say that Judaism has been radically different from Christianity and from Islam.
Yeah, and even so, Moses Maimonides, he's oftentimes confused with Nachmanides, right? But they're very different people. He's also a Spanish rabbi who ended up moving to Egypt. Maimonides has a famous essay where he addresses your question, where he says, well, even the 7 nations that the Israelites in the book of Joshua eventually push out, this was only after attempted peace treaties, right? It's a very interesting essay because this is not what the Tanakh says, right? If you go to Hebrew study, next time they wrap around to Joshua, you can ask Cindy when exactly that'll be, probably a couple of years. But the book of Joshua does not start out with, they tried to, sit down and make a peace treaty. But Maimonides says, well, there's no way that's how it happened. This is only reflecting the political reality after an attempted peace treaty. But because that wasn't possible, then now you need, necessary war.
We now turn to our next source, which is from Talmud, Shabbat 33a. And that's what it says. Due to the sin of prohibited sexual relations, which is, of course, Leviticus 18, and idol worship, and failure to let the land lie fallow during the sabbatical jubilee years, exile comes to the world, and they exile the Jewish people from their land, and others come and settle in their place. So there's an awful lot here, because on one hand, kind of like more traditional morality, but on the other hand, it also calls for a very radical system of of a social reboot every 50 years. So that is a pretty high yardstick against which Jewish people should be measured.
Yeah, and I think it comes with the interesting, motif of Jewish tradition, which is quite radical, which probably a lot of us would reject today for good reason, but which is, if something bad happens, you face inward first and ask yourself, what did we do to cause X, Y, and Z bad thing to happen? Again, I wouldn't recommend this as a theology for the 21st century, but in some sense, it has been one of the main motivators of Jewish tradition, because there were people, just the historian in me, just to go a little bit, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries that the Talmud was being written, right after the temple was destroyed, there were many people making the argument that essentially the destruction of the temple meant the end of Judaism, right? Judaism obviously was just wrong or incorrect, or God changed God's mind. And so, Judaism had a good run in the ancient world, but now there's no more need for Judaism now that Jerusalem is destroyed. And the rabbis were kind of countering that theology, and the rabbis were saying, no, Jerusalem being destroyed doesn't mean that God was giving up on the Jewish people and Jerusalem as an ideal. It just meant the Jewish people weren't living up to their ideal, which then set this imperative that Jews have sort of been living under for the last 2,000 years of only when we reach the ideal, then we merit to go back to the land of Israel and Jerusalem. And so the rabbis are kind of countering an argument that they probably were, coming into contact a lot, especially with early Christianity and then the Roman Empire's adoption of Christianity, with the dominant view being, Judaism's just over, it's run its course. And the rabbis were saying, no, we as Jews weren't actually living up to the Jewish ideals as outlined in the Torah. Therefore, exile has come to the world based off of this. And the corollary is, when we reinstitute these things, whatever modern version we would think of, all of these different categories, that's when exile ends, and that's when you can actually, rebuild the world, or, in more modern language, the idea of tikkun olam, which, oftentimes is translated to just social justice, but tikkun olam literally means fixing the world or fixing the universe. And so in the rabbi's mind, moral action leads to fixing the universe, which then, puts everything back together again.
I think let's move to Talmud Yoma, which is the tractate about Yom Kippur. And this is a very short verse, but we come an awful lot to it. So why was the second temple destroyed? Because of baseless hatred, or sinat hinam. So literally, hatred that you get for free. So kind of unmerited hatred at all. There's a famous story how of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, how the rabbis have done nothing when there was one person who was humiliated, and that spiraled to an attack of the Roman Empire. And I think this is actually probably the bit of the entire temple stuff that most resonates with me, because I feel like baseless hatred is something that one definitely experiences a lot in Israel. There's a lot. There is a reason why different segments of the Israeli society should oppose policies of one another, because they have opposing interests. But there's a difference to oppose somebody because you have a point, and a difference oppose somebody and then kind of really hate somebody else's identity. So Israeli society is internally extremely divided, and I think many Israelis have a sense that we have reached a point where, there's so much internal turmoil that there's just a lot of hate in the air.
Yeah, and even, today, I'm trying to do the math, is the 39th day of the Omer, the 40th day? Somebody can probably take a calendar out and get me the exact date there. What is it? Oh. But with the Omer, the entire first 33 days of the Omer commemorate this period where Rabbi Akiva's students, a rabbi in the 2nd century, was dealing with the loss of, the Talmud gives a very hyperbolic number of 14 or 2,800 students. And these students are essentially, there was some plague that erupted, and these students ended up, all dying. And the idea was that it's because these students didn't show respect to each other.
And now we have a quote that comes from, it's a longish quote, so I will leave it to Rabbi Daniel. And it's a quote from a book of a conservative Rabbi, Shai Held, who's now very much involved in Hadar, which is this kind of egalitarian but fully commitment to observance community in New York, now kind of expanding. So a wonderful institution all in all. He's an Harvard-educated rabbi and theologian who's really one of big thinkers in Judaism in America, and he wrote a wonderful book that I really recommend to you all called Judaism is About Love, which basically counters the claim, because there has been this thing that Judaism is about only law and Christianity is about love. And he says, not so fast. I can find pages upon pages, 700 pages of sources proving you wrong, that Judaism is also about love. So it's kind of his love letter, pun intended, to Judaism. Rabbi Daniel, the floor is yours.
Sure. The experience of being a stranger is thus built into the very cultural DNA of the Jewish people. To be a Jew, according to these texts, is to remember what it's like to be vulnerable and susceptible to exploitation, and to strive to grow in compassion in response. Even after the people are redeemed from slavery and brought into the land, God tells them that at the deepest level they will always remain strangers, instructing them that the land God gives them must not be,
Let's scroll down.
I guess, sold indefinitely. Sold in perpetuity. Owners must be given a chance to redeem the land that had belonged to their ancestors. God explains that, quoting Leviticus, "The land is mine, you are but strangers and residents with me." In other words, being a stranger is not just a historical memory from the past, it is an existential reality that is always also true in the present. Living in the land, the people remain dependent on God's mercy and goodwill. One of the Bible's key hopes, it seems, is that an awareness of their own vulnerability and dependence on God will render the Israelites keenly sensitive to the needs of those who are vulnerable and dependent on them.
So when I read this quote, which is a quote of a conservative rabbi, I always think how close actually it resonates with the writings of the first Zionist thinkers. So the first Zionist thinkers would tell themselves they are completely secular, yet they envisaged a society which was supposed to be for the betterment of all. And if you think about, the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which was supposed to be, a Jewish state, but also a state that was supposed to elevate the living conditions of people living there, it's very much this spirit of, we want to create a better society. Is it somewhat idealistic? Sure. Is it naive? Sure. Is it aspirational? Sure. But is it also one of the reasons that Israel has, in many ways, in such a short time, excelled as a country in, doing things that most nations of its size and, resources would not be able to excel, to reach? Also true.
Yeah, I love it. No, Gershom Scholem, who is probably the foremost scholar of Jewish mysticism in the 20th century, also one of the early Zionists, he had this famous, essay where he pushed back against early Zionists being secular. And even though they said that they were secular, what Gershom Scholem said is, Judaism's always had this latent messianic impulse that at times had been, more bubbled up than others. But there's always sort of been this idea of, unlike in other traditions where messianism is only about, hope and faith, Jewish messianism's also included, action, right? Like tikkun olam, how are you actually going to get there? And that in his reading, Zionism is one of the outgrowths of this, long, latent messianic outpost, not in a radical fundamentalist way of, yes, one day, a temple will, drop from the sky, but in Sholem's view, Zionism was the exact way that Jews have thought about messianism now applied to building a state with all the moral factors that are necessary within a state. And this is something that very much a lot of the early Zionists kept in mind, even if in their mind they weren't creating a religious Jewish state. We can probably debate until next Shabbat what it means for Israel to be a Jewish state. And of course, they had that argument also in the early 1900s. But almost all early Zionist thinkers said there needs to be some Jewish cultural or ethical elements intertwined with the state, which, as Rabbi Mati said, when you open the Israeli Declaration of Independence, you get quotes from Isaiah and Jeremiah and the ethical tradition, and then the Knesset in the 1980s passed a really interesting bill that essentially says if a new court case comes up, and this is a case that Israeli law hasn't decided on before, the court is able to use a multiplicity of legal traditions, including the Jewish Talmudic legal tradition. And this is exactly actually what you've seen. One of the most interesting, and somewhat politically interesting formulation of this is during the first Lebanon War in 1982, there was an episode that happened in Lebanon called Sabra and Shatila, which, without going too much into a rabbit hole, a Lebanese Christian militia group that was working with the IDF in Lebanon carried out, some terrible acts in a village, and they, had this mass killing. And so Israel launched this massive investigation into, what exactly happened here, because the IDF does not go into villages and kill innocent civilians. And at the end, this commission determined, and I'm sort of, paraphrasing it, but it said, this isn't a direct fault of the IDF because the Israeli army didn't really know what was going on with this group. It's called the Phalanges. But we have in our tradition this idea that's, also appears in Deuteronomy called the Egla Arufa, which is if you find a dead body anywhere, you go to whatever city and town is the closest, And the elders of that city, either the rabbis or the political leaders, have to hold this whole ritual where they sacrifice a cow, and it's this whole ritual outlined in Deuteronomy. And the entire point of this ritual is saying, you as leaders, political leaders, judicial leaders, rabbinic leaders, you actually do hold some moral culpability for this, even if you had nothing to do with it, because if you would have created a little bit more of a welcoming environment, maybe he wouldn't have been out alone. Or if you would have had a little bit of better societal resources, right, maybe you wouldn't have driven other people to kill him. And so in the Khan report that the Israeli government put out, you can still read this today, they talk about Sabra Shatila. They say this is not the fault of the IDF, yet our ethical tradition says, well, culpability is not just about fault, it's also about saying, what are other ways we could have done? They quote this entire debate in the Talmud about how to do an Eglah Rufa, and they say our political leaders are thereby still hold some responsibility for this episode, which is a fascinating intersection of all these things.
I think if there's something that can kind of bring it home here is that very few nations have in their DNA a sense of like being, a mission statement, like an ethical mission statement. And I would say that actually what connects America and Israel is the fact that both of them are nations that want to be a beacon of hope, a source of freedom and light to the nations. So one could say that that this is something that Israel has in common. As we all know, when you are a nation of this kind, there's when you take upon yourself an ethical responsibility as a part of who you want to be, you're criticized harder because because then you judge against this statement. So just like people, America, calls itself the home of the free and a source of freedom in the world. If America ever supports a country that's not exactly known for its democracy, then people say, look, you just you side with people who are really authoritarian, and Israel, because being the light to the nation is such an important part of Israeli self-understanding and the Jewish self-understanding, apart from anti-Semitism, it also kind of backfires at the Jewish people, because then you can say, oh, what does it mean to be a chosen people? Aren't you just being, jingoistic and self-absorbed and so on and so forth. Maybe let's go to the next source, because I'm aware that time is of the issue. So this is from this week's Torah portion. Let's go a little bit down. Yeah, let's go down to the English. And so this is about this jubilee year that we read about today. Then you shall sound the horn loud in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, the day of atonement of Yom Kippur. You shall have the horn sounded throughout the land, and you shall hallow the 50th year. You shall proclaim liberty, dror, the same word as the swallow, or throughout the land for all its inhabitants. That's the words that are on the Liberty Bell. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return to your holding, and each of you shall return to your family. And then Rabbi John Rayner has a long quote that directly responds to this. Maybe Rabbi Daniel could read it, and then we'll discuss it in conjunction. Rabbi Daniel, the floor is yours.
Sure. The 25th chapter of Leviticus reads like a political manifesto. But if any Democratic Party ever stood on such a platform, how do you suppose it would have fared with the electorate? About as well, I should think, as the monster raving loony party in a British general election. Completely crazy, people would say, totally unrealistic. This idea, for instance, of letting the land lie fallow every 7 years, it would cripple our economy. Even if we could survive such agricultural stoppages, we would surely lose our competitors in the grain markets of the Near East. As regards to the cancellation of debts, what sort of an incentive, I ask you, does that give the entrepreneur to create wealth? The idea of releasing slaves is ridiculous. Why should we deplete our workforce and give up one of our principal economic assets? And as for your harebrained scheme of redistributing land properties every 50 years, you are not going to redistribute my property, chums. No, if Leviticus 25 is the social chapter of Mount Sinai Treaty, we had definitely better opt out of it.
Let's go down.
I'm going to guess that's not the end of the...
No, it's a longish quote.
In these objections, there is much force. Indeed, most of the provisions of the chapter have never been implemented, and some of them never could be. And yet, to try to imagine, as the author evidently did, what an ideal society might look like is not necessarily a futile exercise. At least it is to clarify the general ethical principles which should govern social life, and so set benchmarks against which other, more realistic policies can be measured. And some of the ideals expressed are not incapable of attainment. Take, for instance, what is perhaps the punchline of the entire chapter. You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all of its inhabitants. There is indeed some doubt about the exact meanings of the key word dror. Some scholars think it comes from a Babylonian word, duraru. The more conventional view sees it as a native Hebrew word for freedom, perhaps connected with the identical Hebrew word for swallow, which occurs, for instance, in Psalms as a sparrow finds a home and the swallow has a nest where she lays her young. What, by the way, might the connection be? I had always assumed that the swallow might become a symbol of freedom because of the ease with which it flies, and therefore because of its apparent freedom from the gravitational pull of the earth. But there is another interpretation. Abraham ibn Ezra, the great medieval Spanish Bible commentator, says a dror is a small bird which sings when it is free, but which, when held captive by a human being, refuses to eat until it dies. However that may be, the word dror in our verse came to be understood to mean freedom. And because it said, you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants, it was further understood to be a demand that, as a matter of justice, freedom must be granted to all sections of the population, including those that have been traditionally oppressed. Therefore, our verse, far from remaining merely theoretical, has become the rallying cry of many very practical liberation movements. And if that rings a bell in your mind, it should, because our verse was in fact inscribed on the famous Liberty Bell, which was installed in what is now the Independence Hall in Philadelphia in 1753.
Thank you so much. So now you know where my Samer comes from. It has to come from somewhere, and you also know that this is what's American independence was all about. America was like a little swallow, flying free and flying solo outside of the shackles or the cage of the British Empire. And I don't know, jokes aside, Rabbi Daniel, how did you feel reading this text?
I love it. I think within Jewish tradition, just to kind of go back to these, two poles, Judaism's always outlined a hyper-idealized way of what it wishes the world would be, which is never going to be the reality, at least now, right? The entire idea of a messianic age, going back to Gershom Scholem, is that there one day will be a time when everything is utopian and perfect, and the idea of Gan Eden is there one time a very long time ago was this time when everything was perfect and utopian, and we recognize that utopia is not a great real politics strategy, right? I wouldn't recommend again opening a business and never charging interest and not having workers and obviously that, but for the ideal to always give you that other side of things has been a very helpful impulse within Jewish tradition. As a complete, interesting aside, yesterday I was reading about the American Jews in the labor movement in the early 1900s for a class I'm doing at UCI. And one of the interesting things that historians note is that in the 1910s and 1920s in America, Jews that came in mass from Eastern Europe, there were about 2 or 3 million Jews that came over the course of 25 years, they were hyper-represented in labor movements. And some of it was practical, some of it was because they were, cooped up in tenements on the Lower East Side and had, terrible working conditions, and they would work 70-hour weeks and never get Shabbat off. But also some of it, in terms of the disproportionate representation, is Jewish socialists that, again, had no connection to traditional religiosity, essentially using the language of Jewish religion to advocate for, what we would consider today, very, very basic rights. The right to, take bathroom breaks during an 8-hour shift, and the right to not have to work 70 hours a day cooped up in an air conditioning-less, garment factory in New York. And a lot of Jews were bringing this to the forefront because of things in our tradition that, do talk about things like this. And they would explicitly say, at these meetings of, the Bund, these Jewish socialists who, when people would ask them, what is motivating you? What is the essential Jewishness feature of socialism, which was rooted in not liking religion, right? All of socialism was rooted in we don't like religion. They said, well, even, as a part of Jewish cultural tradition, we have these political ideals that even if, we can look around and say, okay, there's probably never going to be a time where we're in some socialist utopia, despite what Jewish socialists or early labor Zionists might have wanted. It motivated them to say, well, we can at least do a little bit better than we're doing right now, and the next day do a little bit better. And so I love these ideals for Israel.
And I think I would point out that this is kind of the way I always describe this is that there is a certain way in which Jews, when they are not religious, become religiously committed to social causes. You know, so like the most secular Jews I know are usually there's always a cause that they have in mind that they feel passionate about the point of religiosity. So there's a certain sense of like not accepting the status quo that Jews, you know, have and you know they find different outlets to it, even if, you know, synagogue is very far or on their list of priorities, or if they're actively opposed to it, and also kind of like, you know, the fact that people escape from organized religion into activism that kind of embodies what they see as, you know, as the ideals of the religion is very interesting indeed. And then we have a very interesting quote again by the same Rabbi John Rayner, who was a British rabbi, a British Reform rabbi, or he would call himself a liberal rabbi, and funnily enough his grandson was my classmate at rabbinical school and also became a rabbi, so apparently, you know, that runs in the family. In any case, this is what Rabbi John Rayner writes: the oldest midrash on Deuteronomy, referring to the apprehensions that were felt by the Israelites as they approached the promised land, comments, Im ein atem ma'aminim lechaba cha'aminu leshe'avar. If you don't believe in the future, believe in the past. Miracles have happened before our eyes, therefore miracles are possible. Therefore, all may believe in the future. Israel spells hope not only for Jewry, but it is a hope as yet only partly fulfilled. There are indeed those who see in the establishment of the state of Israel the beginning of redemption, and this is the phrase we use in our prayer for Israel. Rashit smichat geulatenu, the beginning of, or also geulatenu is our redemption. That's from Tractate Megillah 17b. They may be right, but if it is the beginning, the end is still very distant. Rabbi Daniel, comments?
No, I love it. I sort of have an overarching comment, but maybe I'll save it for after Micha here.
And then we have one of my favorite prophets, Micha or Micah, who some people call the poet of social protest, and also very often words that he says are identical to the words of Isaiah. So many of his quotes, people knows the quotes from Isaiah. Indeed, you know, kind of like they lived in a similar time and use similar expressions. But this is one of Micah's best known quotes, and this is what he says: in the days to come, or in the end of days, the mount of the house of the Eternal shall stand firm above the mountains, and it shall tower above the hills. And then Ibn Ezra, a Spanish commentator, medieval commentator, says, it is known that the Temple Mount is not high. That's true. If you go to Jerusalem, there are mountains higher than the Temple Mount in the area. And here is the reason why it shall stand above the mountains, even though it's, you know, it's shorter than other mountains. Its name shall spread far and wide, and from all directions they will return to it with offerings, as if it were at the head of all, which means the highest among the mountains. And it will be elevated above the hills, so that all the inhabitants of the earth will see it. Rabbi Daniel, should I read on, or would you like to make your comment now?
No, read on. It's an overarching Mika comment.
The overarching Mika quote, and don't worry, we're concluding, because I see that some of you are in bad need for a nap. And then the people shall gaze on it with joy, and the many nations shall go and shall say, come, let us go to the mount of the Eternal, to the house of the God of Jacob. Then we may be instructed in God's ways, and that we may walk in godly paths. For instruction shall come from Zion, the word of Eternal from Jerusalem. And you know this one as a quote from Isaiah, but it's also in Micah, Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah u'davar Adonai Yerushalayim, so the Torah service. Thus God will judge among the many peoples and arbitrate for the multitude of nations, however distant. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Again, you know it from a different prophet. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war, but every family shall sit under its own vine and fig tree, with no one to disturb them. For it was the Eternal of hosts who spoke. Though all the peoples walk in each in the name of its gods, will walk, let's scroll down, and this should be the last quote, in the name of the Eternal our God forever and ever. The end, or not, because Rabbi Daniel has a comment.
Well, the vine and fig tree, line, this is not the comment, is, direct letter in George Washington to the Newport, Rhode Island synagogue, which is the oldest current synagogue in the U.S. If you're ever in the exact opposite side of the country, you should go visit it in Newport. And he is essentially, blessing the Jewish community right after the American Revolution. And he's using this quote from Micah to say, America is going to be a place that's going to respect religious difference, and it's going to be a place that everyone could sit in their vine and fig tree. So just like the Liberty Bell, also these texts have motivated, our best, sentiments of poetic idealism. Just to think of this, big picture, because we're obviously at a time now where talk about Israel, the need to defend Israel, and also Israel being, ethically litigated in the international world quite unfairly oftentimes is on all of our minds, which is one of the reasons why we picked this topic. And one of the reasons why I wanted to sort of start with Rashi, and we ended with, we probably started with the most pragmatic, realpolitik quote, and we ended with the most idealistic quote, is that Rashi and the entire Jewish tradition, we weren't strangers to the fact that, well, the world is a real place, and whether we're talking about business or we're talking about land ownership or we're talking about wider ethics of war, as Jacob asked before, Jewish tradition is not strangers to the fact that, yes, there are times to engage in important defenses, whether they be, physical defenses, militarily of the Jewish people, or, ethical and political defenses where Rashi was trying to levy in the Middle Ages. But the thing that I think inspires me the most is, despite all of that, despite the fact that Rashi, there's a lot to say about the difficulty of what the Jewish community in 2025 is going through, it is nothing compared to what the Jewish community in 1096 was going through in France and Germany and during the Crusades. I mean, some of the saddest chapters in Jewish history for, before the Spanish Inquisition and the Holocaust were all about the medieval Ashkenazi period during the Crusades. Jewish writers still didn't give up on this idealism, which is an incredible thing, of seeing the worst things that you can possibly imagine happen, and yet continuing an idealism of, no, but one day there will be this perfect world, and we won't need any weapons, and all of the peoples of the earth, not just us, will be gathered in Jerusalem. And that's a really beautiful thing, and especially when I think, I'll speak personally, my gut reaction is to be the most, realpolitik centric, and, no, it's just about, making sure you have a stronger military, or making sure that your political arguments are stronger and sharper. These give you pause and say, well, that's important, yes, and we should never discount that. And also we have this entire other side of our tradition that doesn't let us give up on this, idealism, and I think for the better.
I think I can relate to this. Those of you who know me a bit closer privately know that I am an extremely sarcastic and cynical person, and yet I am a rabbi. So, I'm kind of like, I'm balancing, kind of like, you're telling me this, you're telling me, about people's highest impulses, maybe, be realistic, and yet I'm a rabbi because I want, even though I'm afraid the world might not be like this, I still believe we can do more. And maybe this is the spirit of, of the Jewish tradition, always, this Jewish survival has always been a balancing act between being realist where you are, or where you want to be and where you want the world to be. And I'm thinking about it in the context of this terrible tragedy that happened, in DC, this week. And I was looking for a way that would close all of this, this kind of realism versus idealism, and the land of Israel, and these two people who, were attending a conference, on coexistence and humanitarian aid to Gaza, and then this happened to them, that was truly heartbreaking. I must say, I didn't sleep much that night because I was thinking so much about it, also because, degrees of Jewish separation. Some of my friends were there in this building, so, so that's a different story altogether. And I found a quote which kind of sums up this kind of meta-level discussion about Jewish realpolitik and idealism. And it's a quote, a poem by a rabbi who's also a Reform rabbi who's also a poet. His name is Rabbi Ivan Schultz. And Rabbi Ivan Schultz writes a poem, and he uses the name of Sarah Milgrim, which was this young girl who was one of those two young people who died. And he writes, Yitzhak Rabin met Sarah Milgrim in heaven. She was in tears. You and I, we drew too close to the well of peace. He said softly, trying to offer her comfort. And why does that frighten people? She asked. Some only thrive in brokenness, he answered. Now what? She asked, as her tears fell to the earth. The angels gathered around them and held them. We pray, he said, as he took a song from his pocket. We pray that there is another Sarah out there. And as they bowed their heads, they could hear the still soft voices below, reciting her name, singing the melodies of memory and peace. So we're always somewhere in a place of mourning, and yet still there's always a part of the Jewish tradition that both tries to be stronger, but maybe Jewish people are able to survive and be stronger because there's a part of idealism in us. Because I feel like if there wasn't an idealism in the face of the impossible, Jews would not have found the strength to be realist. If not for the realism, they would not be alive to be idealists. So we're always holding them both in Israel and here in America. Thank you so much for studying with us. Your studying with us is a great mitzvah because it says that when we study in the memory of somebody, this studying goes in the memory and in honor of this person. I know that Rabbi Asa Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be a blessing, his memory is a blessing, that he had so much Torah of life and love and Torah of Judaism, but I also know that what we can do, we can continue this Torah by engaging and by doing Chavruta and by having you all here. So thank you so much. Somewhere out there, he's there, and I see Elaine here, and I think that he's one of the butterflies here. Elaine always says that Rabbi Asa is here as a butterfly. Somewhere here is the butterfly, very, very happy that we gathered here today.
Both of you for doing it in his blessed memory.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Yes,